We now move on to leaders' questions, and I could call on Deputy Cowan on behalf of Fianna Fáil.
Minister, in January of this year, the CEO of Irish Water confirmed on RTE that in excess of 180 million was spent on the set-up of Irish Water. Many cabinet members, as you know, let alone members of the Oireachtas, let alone members of the public, were aware of the extent of those costs. The Oireachtas was subsequently drip-fed information about the contents of that 180 million, including, for example, the 85 million spent on consultancy fees. Irish Water was set up in a cloud of secrecy under Bord Gáis, despite warnings against that avenue from opposition sources and PwC, whom in 2011 confirmed it would be a more expensive route than the other. What we now have is a massive duplication of tiers of upper and middle management being recruited, while local authorities will continue to maintain and repair waterworks for the next 12 years at least. The government defended the setting up of this white elephant, this bonus-driven quango, by stating it would save the state €2 billion by 2021. The savings that will be made are actually water charges. And we were told in the aftermath of January's debacle by the Taoiseach, amongst others, that what Paddy needs to know, Paddy will know about, and he would know at the earliest opportunity, the government's position and the government's stall well in advance of the local elections in May, let alone well in advance of the first bills in October. And Minister, can I ask you now, are you satisfied that Irish Water is under the full rigour, for example, of the FOI Act? Are you satisfied Irish Water and indeed Minister Hogan's department are acting in an open and transparent manner? And are you satisfied that the public knows where the government stands, in relation to the free allowance?
Thank you.
Knows where the government stands in relation to public subsidy, knows where the government stands in relation to low-income subsidy and first fix pricing policy, for example. Just those issues. Are you happy that since last January, since that debacle and all that ensued thereafter, that based on the commitments that were made by members of your government, including the Taoiseach, that this process would become much more open, much more transparent, and the public who will be asked to pay for a system that might not yet be fit for practice or mightn't be fit for practice in the near future, but that they would at least know what they were facing well in advance, as I said, not only of the May elections, but most importantly, or more importantly, well in advance of the October bill when they arrive through the doors in January.
Minister, I don't accept the Deputy's contention that the biggest new public utility, new public company of a generation, Irish Water, is a white elephant. I don't accept that. In fact, the status quo is the difficulty, not the future. In the status quo, we have a fragmented, underinvested delivery system for the most important of public resources, that is, water to people. We have 34 local authorities using 1.2 billion of taxpayers' money to provide an unsuccessful, inadequate system. There are 18,000 people in public water supplies with a boil notice or some sort of a restriction in place right now. The EPA reports that remedial action is required on 16% of supplies. So 16% of supplies are at risk with schemes such as the Dublin water supply and Cork supply. There are constraints on the capacity for the people of Dublin, a third of the population, as we experienced last year. Unaccountable water loss is over 40% of capacity. 40% of our water leaks. And 36% of water treatment plants weren't up to EPA standards and will probably, if we didn't take remedial action, face legal action in the European courts. So that is the bad system that we have in place. And this government determined that we're going to find the wherewithal to invest to improve that. And that's the genesis of Irish Water, which has a series of benefits for us. Now, you asked a number of specific questions after that. Am I satisfied that Irish Water is currently within the ambit of the FOI system? Yes, because I signed the order myself and that became operable during the course of last month. So it is completely open to FOI. Will there be issues in terms of the migration of 34 local authorities and their staff to a new single consolidated entity? Of course there'll be issues. But if we had taken a different course of action, there would be the very difficulties you'd be arguing about not giving fair deals to each local authority and their workers. That would be the issue you have here, instead of having a proper system to migrate local authority workers into an integrated entity. Right now, we are obviously working on the next phase. It will be a matter for the regulator to determine the pricing structure. That will be done in good time, as the Taoiseach has promised, to allow people to make the budgetary adjustments that will be necessitated when water charging commences at the end of this year and the actual bills arrive next year.
Deputy Cowan, 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Count Corder. Thank you, Minister, for your initial response, at least. You say that will all be done in good time. Can I remind you, Minister, the process that your government initiated, the consultation process that was to be led by the CER, it has begun. And it has begun a number of weeks, and the government, or Irish Water, have yet to make a submission. And there's no sign of that. There's been no consultation, even at committee level. How can you expect the full engagement from ourselves and from the public and from people who wish to engage in this process if we don't know, or we have no idea, despite, as I said, the commitments that was made in this House by your Taoiseach, our Taoiseach and government members, that this process would be open and transparent and consultative and all-encompassing? There's nothing too all-encompassing about the fact that your government, has yet to discuss this at cabinet level, let alone make a submission to the CER and allow him on with the business, as you directed him, to set the pricing process in motion. The public that you and I and others are meeting on a daily basis in the course of the existing campaign are left in the dark. The secrecy continues, and no effort has been made by you or anybody representing you or your minister. The silence of the minister and his department on this issue is deafening, and it's high time that you began to do as you say. It's time to match the rhetoric with some action in this area. The public, as the derogatory term that Minister behind you referred to, that being of Paddy, being the general public, I accept that is a derogatory term, it shouldn't be used, but it was used by this Taoiseach. And the public need to know, they don't know, they're not being told, the secrecy continues, nothing has changed, it's high time it did.
Minister.
The Deputy is creating the notion of conspiracy. I don't know what the other Deputy is mumbling about, Ceann Comhairle. I'm saying that the conspiracy that the Deputy opposite is referring to, he likes conspiracy and problems. In truth, we're dealing with enough real problems, rather than imaginary problems, to be presented to us. We've real issues to deal with in this country. God knows the legacy of your party's term in government. And I'm saying now that one of the big issues we need to do as a people is to have proper infrastructure in this country. And nothing is more important for our people's health and well-being and for those who might invest in our state to have a decent water system. And I don't for a second believe that you over there believe that the current system provided by 34 local authorities, where a third of the wastewater plants are suspect and where 18,000 people are subject to boil water notices, is adequate. Is that your position? After the boom times, when we were awash with money, apparently, as said by one of the members of the former cabinet, we still have that dreadful infrastructural deficit. We're going to deal with that.
Thank you.
And we've said we would. Just to deal with the specific points you raise, my understanding is that the process begun by the regulator started this month, April. It's a two-phase process. There will be inputs from government, but we have to await a determination from our soundings with Eurostat in terms of what amount of money will ensure that this state company remains off balance sheet. And the Deputy knows that full well.
Thank you. Deputy Tobin on behalf of Sinn Féin. Thank you.
Minister, of the expanding number of crises emerging from this government at the moment, the most life-threatening is the ambulance crisis. 2 weeks ago, Primetime broadcast an excellent programme on the collapsing ambulance service in this state, and the details were shocking. In 2008, there were 320 ambulances in this state. Last year, that dropped to 265. Only 137 during the daytime and 113 at night. And that's if the staff is there to actually drive them. There were 21,000 shift hours dropped in 2012, and 14,500 shift hours were dropped last year. The state has half the number of paramedics currently per capita than the North or Scotland. And the result is that the National Ambulance Service is failing miserably to meet its HICWA targets. Last year alone, less than 30% of people with life-threatening conditions were responded to on time. Now, this compares with 75% in England and Scotland. Ambulance staff regularly have to go out on their own, which leads to poor outcomes and leads to injury for themselves. And Gardaí are now being asked to go to emergency situations and ascertain whether or not there is a necessity for an ambulance. Now, these are people who may have had first aid training in Templemore 20 years ago, now being asked to make a clinical decision on whether an individual has to be rushed to hospital in their car or whether they have to wait for an ambulance or not. Now, in the last 12 months, I've received about 35 reports in my own county of people who are in serious emergency situations and that the ambulance were late. And I reckon that other Teachtaí Dála here are in their same situation. Of these occasions, 7 people died. Now, will the Minister agree that a person dying on the roadside for an hour waiting for an ambulance is unacceptable? Will the Minister today confirm his commitment to make sure that these cuts are reversed? And how many deaths will it take, Minister, before this government reverses the cuts?
Thank you.
Minister. In response to the Deputy, I can tell you that this government is determined to ensure that people get medical treatment as swiftly, as effectively, as efficiently as possible. Since 2011, a major programme of change has been underway to totally reconfigure the way pre-hospital emergency care services are managed and delivered. One of the things that has been abundantly clear to me in my 3 years as Minister for Reform is that there is an absolute resistance of the Deputy's opposite for any change. You can measure, you talk always in terms of cuts, as if the measurement of inputs as opposed to outcomes was all that matters. When this government came to office in 2011, 3 years ago almost exactly, there were no targets set for the ambulance service. None. Minister Riley has raised the bar annually for response times, and for 2014 a new target has been set for 80% of life-threatening calls to be responded to in under 19 minutes. That's the target set, and we're measuring it now. We didn't know what the situation was pre-2011. You know that the emergency services in Dublin are provided by Dublin Fire Brigade by an arrangement between Dublin City Council and the HSC. The National Ambulance Service is working to modernise and reconfigure its service to ensure emergency pre-hospital care is delivered at an appropriate and timely manner. In particular, a single national control system has been developed, and that will be in operation next year. So there's significant change happening. The review was expected to be completed in early summer. However, the timescale has now been revised in order to allow the results of the National Ambulance Capacity Review to inform the recommendations. So we are having regard as a government to what is happening on the ground. We're changing and reconfiguring the delivery model for health services to make sure the outcome for people, their life chances are better, so that when the first responder arrives, that you can start treatment on the spot. That's what's important to people. So I'd ask the Deputy not simply to always measure inputs into every situation, whether it's health or education or everything else. Measure the and the more you spend, the better. Let's start measuring what the outcomes, the outputs of our systems are, to ensure that our systems are reconfigured, refined and improved to have a better quality of outcome for our citizens.
Deputy Tobin, 1 minute. Thank you.
I'm not sure, Minister, if you actually heard me. I did discuss outputs. I indicated that the 30% of people who are in life-threatening situations are receiving ambulances on time in this state under your government. That is an output. And you talk about change. There is change. There is a constriction of access into the health service at every level, including the ambulance service. Now, you also talked about what things are like on the ground. Well, that primetime show indicated what things are like on the ground. Right now, despite the life-threatening absence of ambulances around the state, we have 60 senior management driving fully kitted out €100,000 vehicles home for their own purposes. And these vehicles are lying mostly idle outside of their houses for weeks at a time. And what's more, we, the taxpayer, are filling their tanks. Now, taxpayers' money in this area is designed to be put into areas to save people's lives, but it is being siphoned off to blue light senior managers on their way home.
Thank you.
Now, this scenario, for me, smacks of that culture of entitlement that was rife under the Fianna Fáil regime and is still coming to light with regards to the CRC and rehab. Is the Minister happy with 60 managers driving €100,000 responded vehicles fully kitted out home, and for those vehicles not to be used for the purpose that they're for? Will the Minister admit that this is mismanagement under Minister Riley's remit? And will he commit today to making sure that this does not happen in the future?
Well, let me answer both questions first. Just in terms of the issue of outcomes and so on. I mean, we need to have a system that the measurement is measuring the quality of service that the citizen gets. For example, at present, if an ambulance responds to a life-threatening incident in under 19 minutes, but the patient passes away, that's regarded as the ambulance meeting its targets. But if the ambulance arrived 1 minute later at 20 minutes and saves the life of that person, and that person makes a full recovery, that's recorded as missing the target. Now, we need to have targets that are geared to ensure the impact of our health service on citizens. That's what we need to do, and that's what the HICWA process that has commenced will do. Not only taking the time that it takes to get to somebody, but also the outcome. And what happens in the interim, where there is ongoing advice being given to the caller so the treatment can commence as soon as the call is made. You ask a particular question in relation to officers and so on. And these are matters that are under review by the Department of Health. We need to ensure that we have an open mind with the resources we have available, and you know that resources are constrained and will be into the future, that we have configured a service that is as efficient as we can, that takes account of best international practice, and with a focus on the best outcome for the people who are dependent upon our health service.
Deputy Healy.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Minister, you've been inviting us to look at outcomes, and maybe we should look at some outcomes of the social and economic policy of this government. The gap between rich and poor in Ireland is now 4 times the OECD average. Incomes in the average Irish household have fallen by 50%, and low-income households lost a greater proportion of their income than the better off. Numbers in poverty have risen, and the depth of poverty has deepened. Not my views, Minister, but the recently expressed views of the OECD, and they confirmed the views of the Economic and Social Research Institute that told us that Budget 2014 had its greatest impact, a reduction of 2% on low-income groups. And it further confirms the views of Social Justice Ireland, who said about Budget 2013, Budget 2013 is unjust and regressive. For the 2nd year in a row, this government has introduced a budget that is deeply regressive, both socially and economically. Socially, it hits people on low incomes, including the working poor, more than it hits the better off. And this is a result, Minister, of this government and indeed the Labour Party reneging on the commitments in the programme for government and breaking the promises made during the 2011 general election. I suppose one of the most blatant of those is the cuts to child benefit. And indeed, as you will well remember, the Labour Party during the 2011 election, in what were Tesco-like ads, and at every door in that election, told the public that Fine Gael wanted to cut child benefit. And you asked the public to put the Labour Party into government to stop the child benefit cuts. The public put their trust in the Labour Party, what happened? What happened was that the Labour Party has supported cuts in child benefits in each year since this government came to office. And the question, Minister, that I have for you are, will you reverse? The question I have for you, Minister, if you'd listen, will you reverse the social welfare cuts, especially the child benefit cuts, the cuts to heating, fuel and telephone for elderly people, and the cuts to carers? And is the Labour Party not ashamed that in these centenary years of the 1913 lockout and indeed the founding of the party, that you would be introducing and supporting budgets that hit low-paid people rather than the super-rich and the very wealthy?
Thank you. Minister.
We listen to the usual political drivel from the deputy opposite. It may have escaped him. Maybe his salary is too healthy here, and his other supports, to have noticed that we've just gone through the worst economic crisis in the history of the state. We have managed as a government to pick up the broken pieces of a shattered economy and brought us now back to growth. The critical criterion that people will look at will be, where were we in fundamental issues like employment? How many people have jobs? When we came into government, we were heading to 500,000 people. Of course, the deputy's not interested even in listening to me. He's fumbling with his papers. We now have falling unemployment. Still too high, 290,000. But the expectation is that we will have unemployment below 11% this year, which nobody would believe a few years ago. We've stabilised our budgets. We've torn up the prom note, the despicable arrangement that was made by the previous administration. And we've brought confidence back into our economy again. So that's the judgment call that people will make. And if the deputy wants to reference commitments made by my party, you also might have not noticed that my party isn't in a single-party government. That we didn't win an overall majority in the last election. And we negotiated a programme for government with a party who won significantly more seats than ourselves. But if you look on balance, on all the commitments that this party, my party and Fine Gael made to the Irish people, you'll see the vast bulk delivered. And I know for some opposite, the very prospect of recovery and renewal is anathema to your political outlook, because there are people on the opposite side who revel in people's misfortune and misfortune of our state because they think they can make political capital from it.
Deputy Healy, 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Cian Corla. Minister, the policy of your government is simply make the poor and the less well-off pay. You made promises in the full knowledge of what the situation was in 2011, in the full knowledge of it. And the situation now, of course, is that the assets of the super-rich are now back above the peak levels of 2006, according to the Central Statistics Office. It means that there are very, very wealthy people in this country, Minister. And your government have chosen, not to make them pay their fair share.
What's your supplementary
question?
You
have chosen not to impose an assets or a wealth tax on them, but you have chosen to hit poor families, less well-off families. And the fact of the matter is that there is wealth out there. It is not being taxed by your government. And the question I have, Minister, is, will you introduce a wealth and assets tax to make sure that the very wealthy in our society, people who are earning €595,000 each per year, that they pay their fair share, and people who have huge assets pay their fair share of taxation?
Thank you.
The deputy will probably be aware, maybe he's not, that we have one of the most progressive income tax regimes in the world. Save only one country in the OECD, our progressive tax rate is the best. In terms of, you don't want to hear it. You don't want to hear it. I know.
Deputy Healy, will you please allow a reply? But everybody in the House wants to hear the reply. Thank you. Not you, just you had your say. Please.
I'm afraid he has a say, but it's a script that he just reads and not interested in the reply. As I said, we have the second most progressive income tax regime, a very high marginal rate of tax that we have defended because the crisis in this country requires people to make an appropriate contribution. But when we do any asset tax, for example, a local property tax, which in every Social Democratic Party would be regarded as the norm, the deputy opposite opposes that too. You see, he's only in favour of fantasy taxes on fantasy people. If we impose the tax, as the deputy has suggested, on people earning in excess of €590,000, how many people do you think that would fall upon in the country, and how much do you think it would accrue to the state?
Thank you.
It wouldn't keep.
Deputy, I guarantee you silence when you're asking a question. Will you please respect the respondent? Now, please stay quiet.
The deputy,
no, stay quiet.
Ciancorla, the deputy is not interested in the answer. He's only interested in making the stump speech. And his greatest regret is that this government's economic policies are actually driving recovery, driving job creation, and bringing investment into this state.
Thank you. That completes